Fair warning, this might be the most depressing video I've ever made. If you want to continue having a nice day, maybe come back another time. Less than a year ago, in October of 2018, I released a video explaining the dire implications of the latest IPCC climate report. It detailed the magnitude of the crisis we face and just how little time we actually have to turn things around. Now, a new United Nations report has gone even further, not only reiterating the scale of the climate catastrophe we're headed towards, but also calling out human rights organizations and the UN itself for failing to act accordingly to avert the crisis. In this new report, drafted by Philip Alston, the UN Special Reporter on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, the data points towards a global-scale failure to address the root causes of climate change, and provides hard numbers for the consequences of our inaction. In this video, we're going to look at just a handful of the crises we failed to stop. We'll start with some hard truths. The poorest countries and populations on Earth will suffer the worst effects of the climate crisis. The poor, who have contributed the least to emissions and have the least ability to cope with the fallout, will take the brunt of the punishment. The rich, on the other hand, both countries and individuals, contribute the most to global emissions and have the means to avoid almost all of the consequences. Not only are the world's biggest players responsible for the majority of emissions, they have profited tremendously from it. The poorest half of the world's population, over 3.5 billion people, are responsible for just 10% of carbon emissions, while the richest 10% are responsible for half of all emissions. An individual in the top 1% uses 175 times the carbon as someone in the bottom 10%. Not only have we failed to curb our emissions, but they've actually been on the rise again since 2017, after having been fairly level for the previous 3 years. The more carbon we pump into our atmosphere, the faster the temperature will rise, which will melt more ice, releasing methane, which heats up the atmosphere even faster, and so on until every coast in the world is underwater. The 2018 IPCC report stated that we should make it our goal to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, because even the tiny half-degree difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees would have enormous ramifications. For example, a rise of only 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees could mean reducing the number of people vulnerable to climate-related risks by up to 457 million. 10 million fewer people exposed to the risk of sea level rise, reducing exposure to floods, droughts, and forest fires, limiting damage to ecosystems and reductions in food and livestock, cutting the number of people exposed to water scarcity by half, and up to 190 million fewer premature deaths over the century. That sounds like a reasonable, noble goal, right? Well, that ship has officially sailed. According to this most recent report, limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees is a pipe dream at this point. And even if we could somehow pull it off through, quote, historically unprecedented societal transformation, we'd still see suffering the likes of which our species has never experienced. Extreme droughts and famine, lost incomes and livelihoods, worse health and decreased life expectancy, 4.5 billion people subjected to heat waves, and the worst affected will be the world's poor. Those who caused the problem will be fine. Now let's move on to some specifics. We'll assume that we can limit global temperature rise to around 2 degrees Celsius. Whether we can actually do that is a toss-up, but we'll use that number for the rest of the episode. At 2 degrees of warming, up to 400 million more people could be at risk of hunger and starvation, and up to 2 billion more people may no longer have adequate access to water. This climate could reduce global crop yields by 30% by 2080, even if we adapt to the new regional norms. Between 2030 and 2050, we should expect to see an additional 250,000 deaths per year from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress. By 2050, upwards of 140 million people in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America will likely be displaced from their homes. And that's not even counting the rest of the world's islands, coastal regions, and other affected areas. Developing countries are expected to bear 75 to 80% of the costs of climate change, costs that they will not be able to afford. This will render those nations far more susceptible to natural disasters, disease, crop failure, and spikes in food prices. Middle-class families, including those in developed countries, will continue to be thrust into poverty. The World Bank estimates that without immediate action, climate change could force 120 million more people into poverty by 2030. The report makes sure to mention that this is likely an underestimate, and that the rate will increase in coming years. Meanwhile, the richest countries and corporations watch from their strongholds, mostly immune to the coming disasters. What's worse, they continue to push misinformation to keep the money flowing, and the amount of money they're making from the world's suffering is staggering. One recent study found that climate change has worsened global inequality significantly, and that the gap in per capita income between the richest and poorest countries is a full 25% larger than it would be without climate change. But at least we have aggressive watchdog groups pushing for serious change, right? According to the report, it's not even close to enough. The special reporter calls out specific groups and organizations, and himself for not previously being outspoken enough about the crisis, and then decries the failure of world governments, saying the essential elements of climate change were understood in the 1970s, and scientists and advocates have been ringing alarm bells for decades. Yet states have marched past every scientific warning and threshold, and what was once considered catastrophic warming now seems like a best-case scenario. He elucidates the failures of the private sector to rein in out-of-control profiteering, and blasts the fossil fuel industry for knowing about the problem for decades, saying, from 1979 to 1983, the American Petroleum Institute ran a task force originally titled the CO2 and Climate Task Force. In one 1980 meeting, it reviewed a report describing strong empirical evidence that a rise in CO2 was caused mainly from fossil fuel burning. The report cautioned that a 3% annual growth rate of CO2 could lead to a 2.5 degrees Celsius increase that would bring world economic growth to a halt in about 2025, and a likely 5 degrees Celsius rise by 2067, with globally catastrophic effects. They knew all this, and instead of changing course, they launched a decades-long disinformation campaign and doubled down on production of greenhouse gases. From 1988 to 2015, fossil fuel companies doubled their contribution to global warming, producing in just 28 years the equivalent of their emissions in the prior 237 years since the Industrial Revolution. During that time, just 100 companies produced 71% of global greenhouse gas emissions. This 2019 UN report is about as damning as it gets. It lays out what's going to happen, why it's going to happen, and who the biggest contributors are. And let's not kid ourselves, the deception from the fossil fuel industry is perhaps the gravest crime in history, and will lead to hundreds of millions of unnecessary deaths. Those companies should be destroyed, and the ones responsible tried for crimes against humanity. Will any of that happen? Almost certainly not. This isn't a call to action. There's not much to be done. Sure, do what you can to reduce your own personal carbon footprint, but realize the criminals who have doomed so many people to this dismal future will get away scot-free. That's all. That's the video.